Hello, welcome to Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota. I'm Katia. Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota is a nonprofit organization based in the state of Minnesota in the United States. The Human Rights Forum is a program hosted by the Citizens for Global Solutions about different topics, events, and issues around the globe with the goal of educating us about important topics. The event is free and open to anyone. If you want to learn more about CGS Minnesota work, please visit our website, globalsolutionsmn.org, and follow us on Twitter, CGS_MN, and Facebook page, Global Solutions MN. Today, we'll be talking about Brazil. To speak with us, I present you Professor Thais Travassos from Universidade de Taubaté, Professor David Samuels from University of Minnesota, and Paulo Vicente Cruz from Amnesty International Brazil. Our first guest is Paulo Vicente Cruz. He is a movement building advisor for Amnesty International Brazil, which is the area in charge of the organization's activist community management and for the initiatives in human rights education. He's graduated in journalism by the Universidade Federal Fluminense. Paulo has previous experiences related to the intersection between education, communication, and social responsibility in the Canal Futura, Rede Globo, and Canal Saúde Cruz, which is a TV channel linked to the Ministry of Health. Hello, Paulo, welcome. The floor is yours. And I would like for you to start by telling us about what you see that are most important matters we should know about Brazil. Hello.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation for this moment. I'm very grateful and honored to be here. Speaking and talking about Brazil is something very hard, particularly in this moment, because we're facing serious threats to our democracy, but I think that we should give a wider glance to the situation in Brazil, because the problems that we face right now, they are very related to some of our structures problems that are in the foundation of our society. What I see in this moment in Brazil is the expression of some of very old problems, like the racism and the social inequalities that are since that the beginning of the nation is as it is. So I think that this gives us some perspective to look to this moment. And I think that the most important thing that I should advise you in this moment is that I'm talking from my perspective as someone that works in the human rights in civil society and as a staff of a human rights organization. And of course that it's impossible to give a complete overview of all the things that we are facing in Brazil. But I believe that the problem that we face, I think that we have three dimensions of in this moment of Brazil that we have to pay attention and take care. The first of all, we have seen in these last years a shrinking of the civic space in Brazil. There is also reduced as simplification of the concepts of of what is human rights and civil rights in Brazil, and it was reduced to some dishonest narratives, and defending human rights in Brazil. To defend human rights in Brazil, you have as the first task, you have to work in a kind of a field of pedagogical fight for trying to recover some of the true values of human rights and what it is, and the other aspect of our challenge in Brazil in this moment is how we mobilize people in a context that people don't trust in institutions, in a context that the pandemic has a terrible impact in the life of many of us in Brazil, and considering the rhetoric anti-human rights that only gets worse. So I think that they are the key elements for trying to tackle in order to fight for human rights in Brazil. But I think that these problems are not only problems that we face in Brazil. Human rights in all over the world, we are facing hard times for human rights defenders and for anyone that defends a project of nation that is related to democracy and liberty and freedoms in some way. And of course that there are singularities related to Brazil, but I think that the challenges that we have here can be applied to other parts of the world. So I would say that we have for this first moment, I would say that we have many things in common, and that we are very linked to each other. And raise awareness about the need of global solidarity is something very important in this moment, because the pandemic brought us the false expectation, the expectation that we would be together to fight against this virus, this invisible enemy. But what happened indeed was that the barriers and the frontiers between the countries were raised and was strengthened, and in some way we are very disconnected in the way how we face our problems as humanity. So and it's so and there is no way to see that as a good thing, because in a way or in another, it's gonna impact all of us. The crisis related to the dynamics of people coming from one way to the other, from immigrants in around the world, is related to the way how we are linked and we are together. The climate changes, they are related to, shows that we are linked to each other, and the things that happens in Brazil and the things that happens in other parts of the world impacted in us in very concrete terms. So I think that the first lesson that we should have thinking about Brazil or thinking about any other country is that we are close. You are closer to you than you imagine, and you are closer to us than we can even imagine. So I would say that this could be the starting point for our conversation, I believe.
All right. Thank you, Paulo. I'd like to introduce our second guest, Professor David Samuels. He's a distinguished McKnight University Professor of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. He received his PhD from the University of California at San Diego in 1998. His research and teaching interests include Brazilian and Latin American politics, US-Latin American relations, and democratization. Professor Samuels currently serves as a co-editor of Comparative Political Studies. His most recent book is Partisans, Anti-Partisans, and Non-Partisans, Voting Behavior in Brazil. Professor, welcome. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm glad I could be here and hopefully give people some insight into what's going on in Brazil today. I want to thank Paulo for introducing these themes that we're going to talk about tonight. And some of my comments will just build off of what he's saying, what he said. But what I want to start with is, Kathy, what you said, what are the most important pressing issues in Brazil today? And I think also there would be three things that I would point to with an eye towards the next election in 2022. The next presidential election will also be all the governors, all of the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of Brazil's Congress. So national elections to determine the next phase of Brazil's politics. And the first would be COVID. We have not gotten rid of it here, and Brazil is still feeling the effects. It seems, I read today, or was it yesterday, that there was a secret revelation that Bolsonaro's wife, President Bolsonaro's wife, was vaccinated when she was in New York, when he was at the United Nations. And this caused a bit of a scandal, because President Bolsonaro has, like former President Trump here in the United States, been kind of a skeptic about vaccines, at least in public. He was vaccinated himself. There seems to be a little bit of hypocrisy that some people in the media were trying to point out, because hundreds of thousands of people have died in Brazil, and Brazil's healthcare system is in far worse shape than in the United States or in Europe. And so the prospects for a full recovery seem even less likely than they do here right now in the United States or in parts of Europe. And that has contributed to a decline in President Bolsonaro's approval rating. Much like with President Trump, if he had jumped out in front of it and said, all right, let's get everybody vaccinated, what's the big deal? If he had kind of changed his tune, it might have made the difference for him in the election. But again, Bolsonaro, who takes a lot of his political cues from Trump, he has doubled down and tripled down, and I don't know if there is such a thing as quadrupled down on the skepticism about certain about COVID in general, about how bad it is. He said, oh, it's just a little cold or a flu at one point, and he kind of joked about it. And I think people who are living through this, and then they see that as kind of a slap in the face. And it's certainly become more and more difficult not to take seriously, whether it's here or in Brazil. And I think that's hurt his approval ratings considerably. So that's the first thing. If you're talking about what's on the agenda down there in Brazil today in terms of politics, is COVID. The second thing would be the state of the economy. And just like in the United States, Brazil's economy went in the tank when the pandemic first hit, and it's made something of a recovery, but not as much as in the United States or in most, I should say, of the wealthier countries. And this is despite the return of economic activity in China. A lot of Brazil's exports are now much more of a function of the Chinese economy than the American or European economies. And so Brazil's economy is improving, but certainly not as much as President Bolsonaro would like, or any of his supporters. In fact, this would be the second factor I would point to that is contributing to the decline in his approval ratings. And his approval ratings, I forget what it is lately, 25% is pretty low. It's certainly not as low as one might get in Latin America. I think the record for a president was 3% or 4% approval rating. I think it was one of the Peruvian presidents, I forget. So that he could still go lower, but I actually doubt that. I doubt that he would go lower, and I'll explain why in a second. But if the economy continues along, kind of sputtering along without a full recovery, I think more and more Brazilians will put the blame where they should, which is at the center of the executive branch of the national government. And that will hurt him in his re-election bid. And so Bolsonaro knows this. He knows he's kind of painted himself into a corner, but he is, if anything, consistent in his being inconsistent, or I should say, he's consistent in his kind of being erratic politically. And he has kind of been unable to find a way out where he can get the economy going, take some credit for some good things, get rid of COVID. And so that's one of the reasons why he's been lashing out so much at the other institutions of government. Again, echoing a lot of what President Trump would say in the United States. He blames everybody else for the problems, and he tries to discount the power of the other branches of government to essentially veto what he would like to do or tell him what he can and can't do. But as we saw in the United States, well, Trump eventually had to leave after he lost the election. And Bolsonaro has basically said, you're only taking me out of the presidential palace feet first, right? In a coffin, essentially. So you'll have to kill me first. And he says kind of crazy things like that. But the reason I think he's never going to get impeached. I don't think he's ever going to be impeached by Congress. And I don't think, and I do think that he will be a competitive candidate in the 2022 elections. The reason is the following, and this is based on the research that I've been doing for the last decade or so on Brazilian politics. And it's very simple to understand that Brazilian politics is divided in a similar way that American politics is divided. There are some important differences. And the main point is that it's very polarized. The politics there is polarized in a way that's very similar to what we have in the United States. It's polarized between supporters of the Workers' Party, which is known by its initials as PT, and the opponents of the PT. Now, President Lula and President Dilma, they were from the PT, and Bolsonaro is what we would call anti-PT. Right? I use the phrase in Brazil, anti-petista. They hate the PT. Now, Brazilian society is divided between about 25% of the population supports the PT, give or take a few percentages. About 25% of the population hates the PT, again, give or take a few percentage. And the rest of the population doesn't care. They're not really into partisan politics. They don't pay that much attention. Their votes are determined by other factors. But the 50% that are either pro or anti-PT, they're really engaged in politics. They are polarized on one side or the other. Now, this 25% of the population that hates the PT, they look for a candidate who they think can defeat the PT's candidate for president. And in the last election in 2018, that turned out to be Bolsonaro, because the center-right of the Brazilian political spectrum could not offer a viable candidate that could defeat the PT's candidate in that election, which wasn't Lula. Now, Lula served 2 terms for president. He's going to run again. He is, if I were a betting man, I would say 100% likely to be in the final round. They have a 2-round election system. He will likely be the candidate to beat in 2022. And he has that support of at least 25%, probably more like 35 or 40% in the first round, of people who know him and really benefited under his 2 terms as president back in the 2000s. And they may be happy to vote for him again. On the other hand, the 25% of the population that really despises the PT, and really hates Lula will never, under no circumstances, vote for Lula. And it depends on how things turn out, but an additional chunk of the population could end up voting against Lula, not necessarily for somebody else. That's the problem that the rest of the political spectrum faces. Is it's either Bolsonaro or somebody else or Lula, and right now there's nobody else besides Bolsonaro or Lula. And so I think it's interesting what Paulo Cruz was saying about the shrinking of civic space in Brazil. Is for the last 20 years, we've seen this PT and anti-PT dynamic in at least, not all of civic space, but in the political arena. And this highlights to me, both on the one hand, the continued strength of the Workers' Party in Brazil. But I think what Paulo was, at least my impression of what Paulo was talking about, is a relative weakness of the left in Brazil in the current, in the last few years, as the right has become much more vocal and organized and vitriolic in public, much like in the United States. The left has kind of pulled back from its prominent public role that it had in the 1980s, in 1990s especially, and then when Lula became president in the 2000s. You don't see as much action in the streets by unions, whether in the public sector or the private sector. You don't see as many large protests by organized social movements, by civil society that would be associated with the left. And the PT has suffered a lot of attacks in recent years. It was involved in a lot of corruption scandals. The last administration, my President Dilma, was beset by a host of problems, economic problems, management problems. She was impeached partly as a result of that, kind of trumped up charges, but mainly because the rest of the political class did not like how she was managing the political dynamics. So what you see is Lula is strong. The PT still has some organizational depth, but there's no other alternative on the left side of the political spectrum that's really viable. And the right has Bolsonaro. But the thing is, Bolsonaro, right now, I don't think he's even a member of a political party. It's very fragmented. It's very personalistically oriented towards Bolsonaro. But their the main organizational kind of drive behind the right side of the political spectrum is their hatred of the PT. Now, this is different from the United States. On the right, we have a very strong political party. When they nominate a candidate, they have that strong party behind them. And in Brazil, they don't have a strong party on the right. They have a strong candidate, but they don't have a strong party. I think that's an important difference. The rest of the Brazilian population is, for various reasons, either disinterested or disengaged. About 50% of the population doesn't really know much about politics in terms of the parties or candidates. Typically, they vote more on kind of local issues or who the kind of big name is in their neighborhood or their state. They may know Lula, they may vote for Lula because of his name recognition, but they're typically much less engaged in politics, and partly that's a result of lower education level, lower engagement with the news, media, lower knowledge about politics. So I'm just kind of to sum up a little bit. I think we've got these kind of important big picture factors going on that are shaping Bolsonaro's popularity, the economy and COVID. But when it comes right down to it, it's going to be Bolsonaro against Lula, who has the organization of the PT behind him. He has the name recognition and the success. He left office with a very high approval rating 10 years ago. And so he has that he can bank when he goes to the electorate and campaigns next year. But he is facing these questions about the PT's involvement in corruption and mismanagement during the 2010s and even earlier. So this is a shaky future, I think, for Brazil at this kind of very high level politics level that I've been focusing on. I'll leave it right there, and then hopefully there'll be some questions later after we hear from Thais. Oops.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker directly from Brazil, Thais Travassos. She has a master's in comparative literature from the program of comparative studies of literatures in Portuguese by University of São Paulo, USP. She has a bachelor in Portuguese and English from University of Taubaté, Unital, and she is a professor of Brazilian literature, literary theory, and comparative literature at Unital. She also teaches literature in writing for high school. Thais, thank you for accepting our invitation. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be speaking to Citizens for Global Engagement. I'm probably making a mistake with the name of the entity. I'm so sorry. But I'm very happy to be here and to be able to speak about Brazil and about what's going on here right now. I teach literature, I teach Brazilian literature, and I study comparative literature. So I'm not here as a professor only. I'm here as an activist and as a citizen and as someone who has been witnessing Brazilian politics for the past years. So it was very interesting that Paulo and Professor David, they set up a landscape so that people can understand what's going on here. But I would like to give a step back just so that we can, people that are not really familiar with Brazilian politics can understand what's really going on here. So since 2015, there has been a lot of investment in right-wing politics and very extreme right-wing politics here. And this has been paid by economic interests that run the country and that run the world, as we all know. But what happened here is that these institutions have they have bought the support of our politicians, and they have been able to set up their policies and to increase the main problems that we have here in Brazil that are related to social inequality. So what happens is we have since 2017, the first year of Governo Temer, of the Temer government, who was the guy who replaced Dilma, who was impeached by, it was an internal coup, as we can call it an internal coup, because an institutional coup, because what happened was that the parliament wouldn't really support her anymore because they were not gaining back what they were trying to do and to pass the laws that they were trying to pass. So there was this conflict, and what happened was, well, a PMDB, that is a big party here, that what we call Centrão, which is a central party that's not really central. That what they do is they support whatever government is in power so that they can have their space in government. They destituted Dilma with the support of these right-wing parties that had been gaining financial support for the past years. And we have lost since then many rights that are related to basic rights. There has been a lot less investment in education in the past years. Just for you to have an idea, we've lost 73% of all the investments in universities in Brazil since 2015. So from 2015 up to now, we've lost 73%, and that's just an average. Some universities have lost almost everything and any support from the government. And we have also lost working protections, because Brazil was recognized until a few years back for having workers' protection, a lot more actually than the worker protection that the US has, for instance. And social security here is also something very, very strong that we have also lost from 2015 to now. And we have been losing rights that are completely necessary, as Paulo very well put, for the participation, the civil participation. So the shrinking of civil participation is directly connected to these losses that we've been having in the past few years. Also, what I intended to speak here was not this at all, but I saw from what the conversation was starting, I thought I had to make this first speech. I prepared a presentation because I wanted you to understand what it means for women, especially, but also for Black people and Black women in Brazil to be losing these fundamental rights that we have been losing in the past years. I will show a few slides just so that people here can have an idea of what it means to be a woman and to be a Black woman and to be a poor woman in Brazil, and how, and my intention is that people understand how fragile these people are, and how in the edge of a very difficult situation most people in Brazil are. And when we lose fundamental rights such as social security rights or working protections, this impacts directly in the defense of human rights, especially for women and Black people, and Black women mainly. So I will present a few slides here. I hope you don't mind me showing that. Can I do that, Katja? Is it okay
Yes.
if I show my presentation? Just, oh, here it is. It's a whole thing of the screening of the presentation. Let me find it. Oh, here we go. So, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you, but everything has frozen on my computer. Just give me 1 second. It's probably, oh, here we go. So, what I mainly wanted to speak about was women and human rights in Brazil, but since I started, I will just try to show how these political losses and these legal losses that we've had in the past years impact on people directly. So it's very important to know that every day 4 women are killed in Brazil. These are data from 2020. So 1,350 women were victims of feminicide in 2020. That's 0.7% more than 2019. 74% of these women were between 18 and 44. So we can see that a lot of young women have been killed. And if we get the data of young men that are killed, this is also an astonishing situation in Brazil, a very complicated human rights problem that we have here. The youth has been killed and a lot of our potential for future has been killed. I don't have any other words to say that. 61.8% of these women were Black, 81.5% were killed by their partners, and 54% inside their own homes. Brazil is the #1 country in the assassination of trans women in the world. And that's another very, very important problem with human rights here. Women do not have, under the Brazilian law, the right to safe abortions and legal abortions. And in the case when abortion is accepted, access to that has been limited, especially in the Bolsonaro government. If I also wanted to bring some data on these racial inequalities that are very, like Paulo said in the beginning, they are very funding of our society. They are the basis on which we built what we call Brazil. So if we see this is an infograph with some information of average earnings for white men, white women, black men, and black women in Brazil. These amounts are in reais. It's just so that you can have an idea. Today in Brazil, five you with $1 you can buy 5 reais. So 544 reais would be something like $100. Okay, so just so that you can have an idea. And another important information that we have to think about when we're thinking about these inequalities in Brazil is that more than 40% of families here have a woman as the main responsible for the family livelihood. So women are breadwinners. They are the ones that support the family financially many of the times here. And even when it's not the woman also takes part in the sharing of the bills. Women earn, however, in average, 27% less than men for the same job position. And women are the main responsible for the caring of the elderly and the children in Brazil. And one of the ways women have tried to escape this very complicated situation that is being a woman in Brazil is through education. So in the past 20 years, women have accessed more education in Brazil. But what happens is, like I told you, from 2015 on, more and more budget cuts have been made that have stopped women from being able to even reach these steps of education as a path for women. As you can see in this infograph here, you can see the number of women increasing in education. So most white women are educated in Brazil today, and they are the main group of being educated here. And you can see there this comparison. So women have been more present in higher education in Brazil. 25.1% of women between 25 and 34 have a college degree. And this number is lower as women get older, just so that you can see that in the past decades, this access has increased. This information I took from IBGE, which is the Institute for Geography and Statistics here in Brazil. And as you can see, education has been in the past years, even if very slightly, a way for women to have a more access to civil participation, just as Paulo said. And what is happening now is that with all these cuts in basic rights and social security has affected directly, especially Black women, Black men, Black young people, and women. And this is something that has to be said and has to be understood. Just the pandemic has created Professor David, he was talking about how the economy is. As someone from within the monster, I can tell you that things are a lot worse than they seem. Professor David, I don't know if I can call you Professor David or Professor Samuels, you let me know. What's happening is inflation has always been a problem in Brazil, but from the 90s on, they had some economic changes that were able to stop inflation that we had, that was something like 60% a year. It was something absurd. And now what's been happening is that we're seeing inflation coming back. And what happens when inflation comes back and the minimum wage doesn't go up is people go hungry. And who are the people that go hungry first? Black women, young people. I will not repeat it anymore, because I think I've made myself very clear. And the economic here hasn't really shown any signs of improvement. What has shown some signs of improvement is the idea that maybe commodity prices will go up, and maybe these commodity prices will increase exports, and which is something that has already been happening because the dollar is so high. And what happens is this government, just so you can have an idea of the absurdity of things that we're living here, we've always had a surplus in production of rice and beans that are the main grains that are consumed by Brazilian population. So the government always had a surplus to avoid inflation affecting these basic foods, so that the population wouldn't go hungry. And Bolsonaro and his government has cut that to almost zero. So what happened is prices went up, and people haven't been able to eat as well as they ate before. They haven't been able to buy cooking gas. What we have here is those gas tanks that people have to buy. One gas tank is 100 reais, which is 1/10 of a minimum wage. And a family of 5 doesn't really have the money to buy gas and to cook. So people have been forced to cook with wood, with firewood. And it's this level of absurdity with climate change and all the destruction of the Amazon and the destruction of other very important hotspots of natural life in Brazil, has made a water crisis even bigger, something that we've been going through for the past years. And now, because all of our electricity source, it comes from the water, from the rivers, we haven't been able to have enough electricity. So we run the risk of not having electricity as well. And electricity prices are up. I mean, really up. It's 50% more expensive than it was last year. So these things have a direct impact on the lives of Black people, on the lives of Black women, and on the lives of women in Brazil. And I'm sorry I extended myself too much, but I hope I've been able to show you what we've been going through here in Brazil, and how this has affected basic human rights.
Thank you so much, Thais. I would like to open for questions from the audience. Do we have any?
I saw in the chat at least one question. Gail, do you want to unmute and share your question?
Oh, I was just wondering what role the US has been playing in Brazil.
I can start off by responding from the US perspective. Biden does not like Bolsonaro at all. And I think the feeling is mutual. Bolsonaro was one of the last people to call Biden to congratulate him on a victory. And I think Biden basically wanted to say, yeah, nobody's home. I don't think he really even wanted to acknowledge. That's the kind of status of the diplomacy right now, is he doesn't even really want to acknowledge Bolsonaro as a he's not going to give him an invitation to the White House, certainly no kind of state dinner. It puts Brazil in a bad position because it signals a kind of low priority for Brazil. The United States doesn't have a pressing issue right now with Brazil as it does with, say, Mexico or some of the Central American countries in terms of, say, immigration, or with Haiti, any of these other Latin American countries. The reason that Biden can't ignore Brazil right now is because of China's increasing influence in Brazil. That's mainly kind of geopolitical issue. Is you can't just simply push Brazil away because there are other options in the world these days. But the strange thing is that Bolsonaro has such an abiding admiration for the United States, and particularly for Trump and conservative politics in the United States, that he really wants and needs that connection to the United States, even though he doesn't really agree with Biden. So it's kind of an impasse right now. There was some stories circulating about the kind of very kind of stalled out diplomatic efforts behind the scenes between the United States and Brazil. It's really quite bad for a country of Brazil's size, and that at one point, if a decade ago, was trying to negotiate for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, to be in a position where the U.S. president can effectively ignore it. And Bolsonaro doesn't have much to offer right now, so it's kind of in a stasis situation. So I don't see, historically right now, the United States is kind of at a relative distance compared to its involvement, say, in the 1960s or even the 70s. It's not to say there's no connection. Certainly there's very deep political and business connections, especially, but right now the United States is kind of hands off. We don't want to be seen as meddling. We don't want to give Bolsonaro any kind of fuel for his anger and his red meat to throw to his supporters. That's at least the perspective that I have over the last year since Biden was elected.
I have a follow-up question for that. It's mainly, as Americans, how can we help to improve the human rights situation in Brazil? Is it best for us to lobby our own politicians, or can we do anything to influence the politicians in Brazil, coming as Americans, basically, are things that we can do to help the situation?
Well, speaking as an Amnesty staff, I think that we have a lot of things that we can do for Brazil. And I think that one of the things that we can do is pressure your politics. Because USA have a strong influence in Brazilian politicians. So politics. So I think that it's very important and it has to do with, I was talking in the start of this conversation. I think that we are connected in somehow, because at this moment, there are more people, Brazilian people, immigrating to the United States because of the crisis, as there are more people immigrating from other parts of the world because of the crisis in other parts of the world. So we are connected in somehow. So, and I know that it's not it shouldn't be the main reason why we should mobilize for Brazil. But I think that it's just a way. I'm just saying that it's an example that is how we are linked. Our histories and our destinies are linked in some way. And just in addition to what Professor Samuels said, I think that indeed we have in this moment a very tricky situation related to the relationship between Brazil and the United States, because actually there is a lot of influence and of China trying to enter in our economy and establish economic relations with our country, and United States have some interest in trying to some way try to reduce the influence of China in our country. But at the same time, Bolsonaro is a toxic guy. So it's a moment in which our diplomatic relations are freezed in some way. But I think that this is something that will be important issue for our next future because Bolsonaro is isolated in the role. Just the right wing, the extreme conservatives are support Bolsonaro. So when Biden have the diplomacy that is aware about the sustainability of the world, about the emissions of carbon, and these things make Bolsonaro become more isolated and more weak in political terms internally as well. But it's also tricky because as Bolsonaro has to use to create every time public enemy, the environmental agenda in some way can be used by Bolsonaro as a way to establish this public enemy for his group of supporters. So the moment is quite complex for our internal relationships and all to our external relationships.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on that as well. I think what happens here, especially here in Brazil with people, with Bolsonaro supporters, is that they have this very strange relationship to the US. They have the US as a model, and the American way of living as a model, but the rhetoric of Bolsonaro government is also based on, look, we have to protect our country from ONGs that are trying to take the country and to steal the Amazon from us, and the third sector is gonna come, and the communist conspiracy, and they're going to take over the world. The very same rhetoric that you guys have been listening from the alt-right in the US, we have been seeing here with this government. It's the same Trump rhetoric, but in a country that has a very fragile democracy, which makes things a lot worse. So I think that the role that American citizens can play is, first, publicize what's happening here. Second, pressure the Biden government to tackle into that, because we know the Americans can still make a lot of decisions in ONU and the UN, and there's certainly a lot that can be done.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to mention something that Professor Samuel comments in the beginning of our conversation, when I was mentioning the shrinking of civic spacing, I was meaning that in previous governments in previous period, we had the possibility of participation in councils as community members, as civic social organizations, and the role and the dialogue with public authorities and in public institutions was easier than now, and this path was interrupted in the moment that Bolsonaro assumed the presidency. and the possibility of trying to establish any kind of dialogue is very difficult, and it's bring us to a dilemma as well, because how we can pressure a government and how we can mobilize people to fight for the against human rights violation, and using tactics of naming, shaming in a world and in a country, specifically speaking about Brazil, in which the political leaders don't feel ashamed by violating human rights. And I think that's a dilemma not only for us Brazilians, but also for in the rest of the world. When Trump was in power, it was a dilemma. I believe it was a dilemma for Americans as well, because these guys don't feel ashamed.
We have a couple of questions from the audience. From Kimberly, she asked about indigenous peoples. Indigenous people are being pushed from their lands. What political power can they access to protect themselves and their homes?
Right now?
Sorry.
Go ahead, Paulo, go ahead.
The indigenous movements is very strong in Brazil and historically. And the situation of the indigenous people, unfortunately, is not something new. Even when we had progressive government, the situation of indigenous people was very bad. So, but they are very well articulated, and they try to push the public authorities, and even in international spaces like UN and the international court, as the case of Bolsonaro, that APIB, the Articulation of Indigenous People of Brazil, now is trying to sweep Bolsonaro in the international court. But the thing in this moment is that the institutions that have the mandate to protect the public institutions that have the mandate to protect the indigenous people, they are being dismantled by Bolsonaro's government. So people that are responsible for to be the leaders in these institutions, they disrespect indigenous people, and they work against the interests of indigenous people. So it's a very contradictory situation, because there is a planned dismantling of the structures that could protect indigenous people in Brazil.
Yes, I'd also like to comment on that. I agree with Paulo. The indigenous people have always had their land threatened by the Brazilian government, and they have been threatened with very questionable decisions made by the government of Dilma, especially, but also Lula. And what is happening now, I will say it again, is the destruction of basic laws that protect those that are vulnerable in Brazil. So if you belong to a minority in Brazil, you are in danger. Indigenous people have always been in danger. And they, right now, as Paulo said, have seen all the very little that had been accomplished by the very hard fight made by the institutions of indigenous people that have been fighting forever. In 1988, when we passed our democratic constitution, they have been losing those rights right now. And they have lost every possibility of having anything from the government. What they're doing is just trying to fight with their organizations and having some kind of access to the UN international support.
Let me just make a brief comment about this too. I mean, I think I don't want to downplay the importance of indigenous people's rights, but I do want to add some perspective to this, because I think that the overall human rights situation in Brazil has become so much more grim. And it's important to remember that indigenous people are 0.5% of Brazil's population. But the human rights situation in both cities and the countryside, 80% of Brazil's population lives in cities now. And particularly for Black or brown people, as Thais has been talking about, for poor people and Black or brown people, I mean, the attitude among Bolsonaro is the very kind of mano duro, the hard fist kind of attack on crime. And if people get hurt, get caught in the crossfire, well, too bad. The only good bandit is a dead bandit is a common phrase you hear in Brazil. And it's just a real kind of overall disrespect for human rights is a kind of modus operandi of the Bolsonaro administration. Not that any previous administration had made Brazil a real paradise for the protection of human rights, but there had been some advances, some significant advances in citizen involvement and protection of human rights, and in creating councils and in creating new legislation. And I mean, significant advances in protection of women's rights under Lula's government. And it's all been reversed in general. So I just want to kind of broaden out the perspective. I think it's important to have that perspective.
Yes, and thank you for saying that, David. And I posted in the link in the chat about what President Bolsonaro has said about indigenous people, and I wanted to remind everybody and to tell, for those who were not aware, that when he was doing his rallies in his campaign, he never made secret of how he felt about indigenous people, and he made serious racist and serious bad remarks, and some of them are in these links, like the Indians don't speak our language, they do not have money, they do not have a culture, they are native peoples. How did they manage to get 13% of national territory? The Indians are evolving more and more. The Indians are evolving more and more. They are human beings like us. Indigenous reserves are an obstacle to agribusiness. You can't reduce indigenous land by even a square meter in Brazil. So when he was speaking that that's when he said that when he was elected, he would end the reservations. So there was no secret about what his intentions were in regards to indigenous people. Yes, Paulo.
No, just a comment related to what Professor Samuel said. For sure, I think that it's important to have a wider perspective about human rights violation in Brazil, and indigenous people are not, of course, the majority of our population. But I think that the way how this government deals with the indigenous issues shows how the minorities and it's also important to in perspective to look in perspective to the human rights violation, to say that it's undeniable that we had a lot of progress in terms of social achievements in Brazil during Lula government and Dilma's government. But at the same time, these same minorities, Black people, women, and these minorities, they still, unfortunately, they were impacted by violence and even this war on drugs, for instance. and the levels and the rates of deaths in Brazil because of gun violence, they did not diminish in this since then. And as I was saying in the beginning of our conversation, I think that it's important to frame the things that are happening in this government, and it's a terrible moment in our history in Brazil, of course, and I'm not denying that Bolsonaro is the worst president that we had at this moment in terms of human rights as well. But it's important to highlight as well that we've been having the escalation of some of our patterns of human rights violations in Brazil. And it's not a new problem. It's a problem that came from old times. And look to that is looking in a very honest way to how our society is structured, based on racism, on social inequalities and privileges as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I'd like to just make a comment on that. I agree with you, Paulo. I believe that it's very important that we understand that Bolsonaro is nothing but a consequence of many of the very bad decisions that we as a nation have made in the past years, especially related to how to the choices that we've made in our legislators. And we have very problematic legislators, and we've always had, and we are in a very violent society and very unequal society. But we have to see, and I think that's very important, that we were going through a path in the last decade that was very different from what we're seeing now. That what we're seeing now is the destruction of the very few basic constitutional rights that had been established in '88, and that had not at all reached everybody in Brazil, especially if you go to the outskirts of large cities, or if you just go inwards Brazil and reach poorer people, you're going to see that democracy has never really existed in many parts of Brazil. That's why it's so difficult to understand Brazil, because it's so vast and so different. And what I think that we have to set our foot on and understand is that this destruction cannot happen, because if we accept this destruction, I don't know what we're going to build in place, and how long it's going to take for this very minimum that we had before to reach these people that never had democracy or human rights. These are just these things we people in the academic world think of. And well, that's my comment on that. I think we have to establish also these things that are very important.
And Thais, you're right when you say that this is kind of a product of our legislators, the Brazilian legislators. Partially it's the fault of the people who elected, who chose the Bolsonaro, but I wanted to remind that there are more than 100 requests for impeachment of Bolsonaro, and it's unlikely that they are going to be put in the agenda by the Speaker of the House, because there is no political momentum, and I'm quote unquote, as they say. However, when President Dilma was impeached, even the right wing who impeached her, they had a majority, they were all in agreement that she was an honest president, and it was not because she committed a crime. And just like in the United States, in Brazil, in order for you to be impeached, you needed to have committed one of the crimes or administrative irregularities that is set out in the Constitution. So she didn't commit any of those. And whereas Bolsonaro has repeated some and has committed some new ones, and the impeachment files were never moved out. So that means that he has a good base, and it's not necessarily because he's wonderful, it's just because he has a good base. And also just wanted to mention, there are more than 100 files and complaints against President Bolsonaro in different international organizations like United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, international ICC, International Criminal Court, the Inter-American Human Rights Court. So there are organizations, and those were filed by different international organizations based in Brazil and based in other countries. So there are people and organizations that are concerned, and it seems like there is a power that keeps him there, and it doesn't seem to me and that there is a rational reason that we could actually say, well, that's legal reason that we could explain. It's somehow inexplicable for why he still remains in power. But with that, I wanted to pose questions, read the questions from the audience before we run out of time. But I wanted you guys to have the opportunity to tackle those. So how Dick asks, how does social media impact in Brazil politics as compared with the United States in the present day? Similarly about disinformation and misinformation, and I think one of you could actually mention the Senate probe about fake news. The other question there is, how does Brazil compare in human rights to other countries in Southern Cone? This question from Rosa Maria. And Chip asks, the similarities between Bolsonaro and Trump are frighteningly evident. What significant differences are there, if any? I dumped all questions at once. Somebody wanted to tackle the social media.
Well, speaking from my efforts, thinking about my efforts on human rights education perspective, I think that of course that we have a bad influence of social media in our discussions about politics in Brazil and about human rights as well. And I think that we have this challenging, that is how we're going to use simple terms to talk about human rights in a way that people can easily understand, and at the same time not using the same dishonest element of strategies that are used by conservatives, by people that have bad intentions in terms of misinformation. I think that is the point, because we know that we have, because this is a demand, it's a pressure in my work to produce new ways to speak or to talk about human rights with people, but there is a limit to do that, because life is complex, and if you have honest intentions, you have to tackle the complexity of life. And on the other side, people that use misinformation try to reduce and destruct the complexity of life, and put everything in the lower ground, and it's easier task, easier job to do. So try to find the balance. It's still something that I don't have the answer, and I'm trying to find this. If you could help me, please.
And I believe we're fighting an unfair fight, because here in Brazil, internet access is different. Most people in Brazil access the internet through their phones, and their phones have free access to social media such as Facebook and WhatsApp and those apps. You can't really go anywhere else on your internet if you don't put more money on your phone. You can only access those apps. And this, I think, also foments and feeds this diseducation of the population, because like what Paulo said, it's easy to access an easy information that explains everything, and this is what it is, and it's yes or no, black or white, and it's not complex, it's simple. You see, so that's what I believe. And then you also create niches of support that are very hard to those bubbles that are very hard to pop.
Let me just add to that. This is a huge question in political science as to the effect of the last, say, 10 or 15 years of this new social media environment on politics. And the way that my colleagues who study these things closely have tried to explore this is through the kind of chicken and egg issue. Is social media the chicken and polarization the egg, or is it the other way around? And it could be some of both. And my impression, the conclusion from what scholars have done is, in terms of trying to figure this question out, and this applies in Brazil as well as anywhere else, including the United States, is that social media is more of a reflection of pre-existing divisions in a society, and it exacerbates those divisions, but it doesn't give birth to those divisions. And in fact, whether it's my research or anybody else's, it can tell you that now the PT has been around since the 1980s, and it grew in the 1990s. These divisions existed in Brazilian society before Facebook ever got into Brazil, which was only 10 years ago or something like that. And then it grew exponentially. It's certain, in all of these different social media apps really exploded less than 10 years ago. And all of this polarization already existed in Brazilian society. And as Thais was just commenting, what it has done is increasingly siloed people into their niche, into their bubbles. And it has, the way once you get into that bubble, the only information you receive confirms your preconceived notions about politics, and it just deepens your belief that, oh, there's a conspiracy theory on the right, or oh, there's a conspiracy on the left, and it's very hard to reverse these kinds of effects. Now, that's the question that really has stumped all of my colleagues in political science: is how do we get people out of this bubble? I think a lot of it is nostalgia for the good old days. In Brazil, it would be when Global was the only news channel you had, and there are problems with that. Or in the United States, when there was 3 TV stations and then a couple of radio stations and some newspapers, but there was a much more concentrated media environment 50 years ago in any country. And that had its own problems, but today it's a much more niche environment everywhere. I just wanted to return to Kathy's question and Kathy's comment on the impeachment. This is something that I've paid a lot of attention to. And if you look at Brazil's history of impeachments, Fernando Collor in 1992 and Dilma in 2016, 20, whatever it was.
16, yes, it's 16.
Yeah, the reason Bolsonaro is not going to be impeached, and I'll put money on this, which is, I don't have a crystal ball, but I'll put money on this, is because it's simply not in the political interests of what Thais called earlier the centrão, of the center-right, the mass of center-right politicians. Collor was impeached because he was making life hard for people in the same group, these center-right politicians, because he was stealing everything. He was taking what they regarded as theirs. Dilma was impeached by the same people, because what did she do? She actually threatened to pass real anti-corruption laws that would have threatened their careers and their livelihoods. Everything Bolsonaro is doing right now has no threat, no electoral threat, and no threat to their livelihoods of anybody on that end of the political spectrum. Their only interest right now is in Bolsonaro not costing them in the next election. They're happy to let him twist in the wind, because the presidential election has very little effect on many of these politicians' re-election chances or their chances in their future careers. Partly because Bolsonaro has no party. He's not connected to them. They can run away from him. They can campaign against him and not necessarily campaign for Lula. In the US, if you campaign for Republicans, you're campaigning against Democrats and vice versa. It's not like that in Brazil. So the costs of impeachment, there's no point in them actually impeaching him right now. They can play both sides. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing for Brazil. But I think that's really what explains it, is that Bolsonaro has not imposed costs, electoral costs, future electoral costs on these center and center-right politicians. He's too focused on the PT, or maybe he's being smart and saying, I can save my own skin by not angering these centrist and center-right politicians more than I need to. And they don't care. He can go spout his crazy theories about whatever. That doesn't bother them. It doesn't cost them anything in terms of their voter support. So I don't think that's a great thing for Brazil's political system, the fact that the president has zero connection to any party in Congress. That is, somebody asked a question about the difference between Brazil and the US. I think that's a really important difference when we think about kind of the nature of politics in a country. To have a president who has no connection to the legislature, it's really important that the fates of the person who occupies the executive branch is somehow tied to the fates of the people who occupy the half or more, whatever it is, a good chunk of the people in the legislative branch. And Brazil doesn't have that right now.
Even without that connection, they still keep them, the legislative is to keep him there. Differently from Collor in 1992, Collor and Dilma had one thing in common. They both, and Collor, many years later, when he was already a senator, and he is still, he gave an interview and said, he made a mea culpa, that he regretted that he didn't talk to Senate and Congress.
Exactly.
And that's correct. I'm glad that 20 years later he had this, but still it was too late because they convicted him, which was the problem of Dilma as well. Exactly. She didn't talk even with her base. They always, even she was from the Labour Party, PT, and everybody complained that she wouldn't talk to them. And so that was one thing they had in common, Collor and Dilma. What they didn't have in common was she was an honest president, and she was impeached without having committed anything. Not me saying that, it was the Senate report saying, you can Google, the Senate report written by the opposition said, we didn't find anything. And still, they had the nerves to impeach her because she was not, giving. It's almost. I almost feel like I'm talking to a baby. I'm going to impeach you because you don't give me attention.
But in the history of impeachments in the world, I actually counted this for a book I wrote. In the history of impeachments in the world, no party of a president has ever voted, no president's party has ever voted to impeach their own president. And so you can look at the Brazilian Congress right now. No majority in a president's party has ever voted to impeach their own president. So you can look at the Brazilian Congress right now and think of this so-called Centrão as Bolsonaro's party. They're not really, but more or less, that's his support base. But the reason that no president's party ever impeaches their own president is because it's political suicide to do so. You're admitting that you support a criminal. And then the voters go, oh, these guys supported a criminal. We're going to punish them too. So there's absolutely no political interest right now in the Centrão to admit to the voters that they elected an idiot, that they now decided that Brazil had elected an idiot. And that if they do that, they're risking their own political careers by impeaching Bolsonaro. And so I really don't think there's any interest in that. That's what's different about Collor and Dilma, even though they were very different creatures themselves. They are different from Bolsonaro because Bolsonaro has been smart enough to actually keep a relationship with Congress where he's not costing them anything electorally by remaining in office. That's all I really want to point out.
Well, we are getting to the end of our event, and I wanted to, before I finish, I wanted to give each one of you a few minutes to leave us with your final thoughts, perhaps 2 minutes to leave us with your final thoughts about Brazil or anything.
I think I've said enough in the last 10 minutes, so I'm going to just yield the floor, as they say, to Thais or Paulo at this point.
Go ahead, Thais.
Well, I've said too much already. No, I just wanted to thank you guys very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure for me to be here with Paulo and Professor Samuels. It's always a pleasure for me to talk about Brazil and to, I love this country and I love the people here. I've chosen to live here. I want to continue living here and I want to have this as a better country for me and for the people around me, especially those who have never been able to reach the very fragile democracy that we built since the 80s. So thank you. And if anyone wants to talk to me, I'll leave my email there and you can reach me if you want to have any information about Brazil or about anything I said here.
Just like to thank you everyone as well. And it was a pleasure and a very nice moment to share impressions about Brazil with you. And just to say as a light of hope and to not saying that everything is terrible, that is, there are a lot of people resisting to this terrible situation that we are living right now. And even the organizations and the social movements are also doing what they can in their territories, in their communities to resist. And many things that are being done, the minimum thing that are being done and by the governments in this moment, they have to do to the pressure of some of these movements. Some, for instance, the financial aid that they gave to the poor people in this moment in the last year, it was the result of pressure of the work of the hard resistance of many people in Brazil. So there's a small achievements, I think, that shows us that there is a way to fight. There is some light in the end of this tunnel. And I just want to highlight again that we are together in the same planet, living the same experiences, and we are connected, and we should be aware of that. and we should look to each other, having in mind that societies have good aspects and bad aspects, and it's what made of them society made of human people, and it has no sense to look to some country and classify or put it in a category as a underdeveloped country or a, a developed country, and because I think that we are bigger than that. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. On behalf of CGS Minnesota Board of Directors, I want to thank you all for attending. We do hope that this session opened the doors for more fruitful conversations. A special thank you to our guest speakers, Thais Travassos, Paulo Vicente Cruz, and Daniel Samuels, for accepting our invitation and to speak about Brazil. It was a real honor to hear from you, and please do keep in touch. CGS Minnesota will be hosting 2 events in October, a little advertisement. In October 21st, we'll have our 3rd Thursday Global Film Discussion with the movie Worth, and we'll host the lawyer Kenneth Feinberg, who is going to speak about this journey helping the families of the 9/11 victims. And on October 26th, we will have another Human Rights Forum, this time about immigration, with Michelle Rivero, Director of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs in the city of Minneapolis. If any of you want to go back to this conversation, it's going to be on our YouTube channel and in our website. Feel free to go and check it out again. You also can contact us in the cgsmn.contact@gmail.com. Thank you so very much, everybody. It was a real honor to talk to you all and to hear from the 3 of you. I hope to keep in touch and see you next month. Thank you.